So far in this series, we covered pretty much all the ways you can defend yourself. But with defense alone, you cannot win the game, at least not in normal situation. So it's time to learn how to retaliate. But if you try to flail back at your opponent without consideration, you're just going to become the architect of your own destruction. So let's dive deeper into how to do this safely. I've said it before and I'll say it again, if you have the option of making your opponent whiff their attack in the first place, you obviously should try to do that first. But the next best thing is to block. And that's going to happen very often. So I want to focus on how and when do we go from blocking to attacking, or in other words, how do we identify when it's our turn to attack. At the risk of sounding obvious, a critical component of successfully learning how to do this is to really observe what your opponent is doing. Every now and then, I still get the odd comment about the need for quick reactions in fighting games. It is true that having better reaction times than a comatose person is compulsory, and it is true that in some situations, having better than average reactions is going to be advantageous. But here's the thing, humans are creatures of habit. So maybe only people who are built different can react to this 15-frame move, but if your opponent always does the same 3 attacks before, or if they always do it after knocking you down, it becomes a lot less difficult to see it coming. It does require that you are able to identify patterns though, but thankfully this is something you are probably already good at, provided you are human. As I alluded to at the beginning, not all of your attacks are suitable to use out of block stun. So which attacks are good ones to use? As is the tradition, the answer is going to be, it depends. Because it is going to be character and situation specific, but generally speaking, I think there are 4 attacks that you absolutely need to find in your character's move list. The first 2 are going to be your fastest mid and your fastest low. And if your game has high attacks, your fastest high as well, which I'll lump with the other 2. Overheads are almost always too slow to be relevant in this situation, so I'm not including them. It's almost always going to be a standing light attack, more often than not a punch, also called a jab for obvious reasons, but it might be a kick and it might also be a crouching attack. So the best way to know for sure is to go into training mode, turn on frame data display and look at the startup time of the attack. Make sure to be as close as possible to your opponent to get an accurate reading. If several buttons tie for first place in terms of fastest attack, make a note of the one that seems to reach the furthest. The next set of attacks you need to identify for your character are going to be your fastest mid and low attacks that have a longer reach than the previous 2. Next, we need to talk about the concept of the safety of an attack. I'm assuming that you are familiar with the concept of frame advantage by now. If not, you should watch the previous episodes in the series. Put simply, an attack is safe if none of your opponent's responses has a shorter startup than that attack's frame advantage. In practice, this means that an attack that is minus on block can be safe on the condition that you stop your offense at that point. This is more or less character independent because moves are balanced in such a way that the fastest attack for each member of the cast is the same speed plus or minus a frame or 2. For instance, in Tekken 8, almost nobody has a move that's faster than 10 frames, so you can be confident that a move that's minus 9 on block is safe, provided you don't try to follow it up with another attack. If the defender has a move that is faster than the attacker's frame advantage, however, the attacker's move is deemed unsafe, also known as punishable. What this means is that, provided the defender responds with an attack that is fast enough, they are guaranteed to land a hit on the attacker, which gives the defender the opportunity to become the attacker. Granblue has an interesting frame data display for this in training mode, where the character will be colored blue, yellow or red after an attack, depending on whether it's advantageous, safe or unsafe respectively. As you may have guessed, the exercise now is to use the moves that we found to figure out which of our opponent's attacks fit in which bucket. There are 3 ways of doing that: the boring one, the efficient one, and the practical one. The boring one is to go look at frame data tables and the matchup notes that other people post online. For the record, I don't actually recommend this to anyone who is the target audience of this video, but someone's gonna bring it up in the comments, so I might as well mention it now. This method might be useful for people who are already very familiar with the game and are looking for marginal improvements, but for a beginner, there is no point memorizing all this information if you can't recognize the move when you see it, something you can only really do by getting hands-on experience. which leads us to the other two methods. What I would call the efficient method is to use training modes to identify punishable moves. The downside of that method is that for it to work, you need to know how to execute your opponent's offense, which may be another thing to learn, and I know you probably don't have time for that. So what we're left with is the practical way, which is trying to figure it out in the middle of a match. Very simply, whenever our opponent is stringing attacks together and it looks like we're going to spend the next 5 seconds blocking, we're going to probe our opponent's offense with some of those fast attacks we learned. Bear in mind that the punishability of a move relies on you acting as soon as you exit block stun. But the whole reason we're doing this investigation is because we don't know when this moment is. So what do? We do the thing that I would normally advise you against. We mash that button, and that button only. Just to be clear, at this point we're not trying to win the interaction, let alone the round, we're just doing research. So we might lose the round or the game in the process, but that's the price to pay for science. There is of course no point in doing this if the opponent's attack is unambiguously plus on block, or if you're clearly so far out of range that none of your attacks will reach. But when in doubt, you can give it a try. When you mash your fastest attack after blocking your opponent's move, one of 4 things is going to happen. Either your move doesn't come out, or it gets blocked, or you hit the opponent, or you get hit. Each of these situations teaches us something valuable about the interaction. If your move doesn't come out, it means you are still in block stun because the opponent's offense is a true block string and they're not done with it. In that case, you want to keep blocking that string just in case you need to switch to a high or low block. If your move gets blocked, you know that A. This was the end of your opponent's string, B. They knew their last attack was safe, and C. They know that you have a move that will kick their ass if they keep pressing. In FGC terms, they are respecting that move. You just don't know which move it is, yet. What's important to understand here is that whenever you see this, it's your cue to go on the offensive, even if your attack gets blocked, because if you don't, your opponent will keep pressuring you. If your move hits, then great, that's what we're looking for, but the kind of hit we get is important. So you'll need to pay attention to the system notifications. And if you play Tekken, you'll have to check this in replay. Go annoy Harada about it. If it's a punish, fantastic, that's what we're after, and now we know of at least one way to stop the opponent's offense when they throw this particular string, and we should try to remember that. This might not necessarily be the best way to punish, but it's one that's guaranteed to work. If it's a normal hit or a counter hit, then it's still good for you, but that usually means that your opponent's attack was safe and they either decided to keep pressing buttons instead of blocking, didn't block correctly, or didn't block at all. So that response will only work until your opponent gets their shit together. So be careful about the safety of your own moves. If you get hit while mashing, once again the type of hit tells us different things about the interaction. If you got punished while trying to punish, it almost certainly means that your attack whiffed. I would guess because of its range or its attack level, for instance throwing a high attack on a crouching opponent in a 3D game. In that case, the next time this happens, you'll want to try one of those longer reaching attacks I've asked you to look for. And finally, if you got counter hit while mashing, you now have learned that this attack and the one before it form a frame trap. So next time, continuing to block would be a wiser option. With that being said, whichever way you got hit while mashing, the fact that your attack was even allowed to start tells you that there is a gap between the opponent's attacks. And that is something we can potentially exploit, even if that gap is only a single frame long. But that's a story for another time, as the video would otherwise be too information dense. This method of mashing a very specific attack to interrupt the opponent's offense has a name, borrowed from the Japanese, abare. Sometimes this is the best response to a situation and it can be useful as a panic button, but there are a number of reasons why you might want to not default to that every single time. First of all, you might not get a huge reward out of it in terms of the damage you'll dish out while you are on the offensive, because those attacks usually trade speed for damage potential. If the attack combos into itself, mashing it can cause so much pushback that your opponent will end up out of reach before you have the chance to do any real damage. In other cases, your mashing might start a string that's unsafe at the end. It's fairly rare in 2D games, but in 3D ones, moves that are negative on hit are more common than you think, giving your opponent the opportunity to resume blocking, which in turn might make your attack punishable. Once you have found a gap in a given string of attack and the fastest punish for it, if there is one, you'll want to start looking at the opposing character's animations to learn how to see this gap coming ahead of time, so you don't mash that button any more than is necessary. But another reason not to burn Abare into your muscle memory is that in cases where your fastest attack punishes, the gap might be long enough that other moves in your arsenal will also fit and lead to much greater damage for your opponent. As you get comfortable with your punishes, start trying to use slower and more powerful attacks. If that doesn't work, fall back to your previous punish. And if it does, now you have a new option to play with. Of course, you'll have to repeat this process for every string that's giving you trouble, but the advantage of learning things this way in the heat of battle is that you're only learning what's immediately relevant to you. There is little point learning all the ways to punish a character that almost nobody plays, because by the time you meet one in ranked, you will have forgotten them all anyway. The downside of this method is that it relies on your opponent throwing the same attack over and over, and even if they might do that, remember creatures of habit, it might take several matches before you get your punishes down. But that gets you experience you need anyway, so that's still the method I use myself most of the time, and the one I would recommend. Learning how to punish strings out of block stuns and get the most damage out of it is a key skill for getting past the novice level in fighting games. In Tekken, for instance, it is so integral to the gameplay that punishes are what the replay tips draw most of your attention to, and that it's often the first piece of information people look for when learning a new character in that game. But sometimes the attack or string that's causing you trouble isn't one that your opponent throws often enough. So figuring out the punish in combat might take more time than you really care for, in which case, this is where the efficient method of learning comes in, aka leveraging training mode. But this video is getting on the long side and the principle is basically the same, so I'll detail the method in a footnote video linked in the description. Before I go, I need to address a question that you might have been asking by this point. What if my opponent is able to follow up with different attacks that require different responses? You mean mix-ups? Oh yeah, these are a thing. In episode 0, I said that making you guess wrong is one of your opponent's goals in a match, so that's not a problem that you can ever fully solve. But as the fight with a given player goes on, and they keep using a string of attack that can end in several ways, you might notice that your opponent might favor one option above the others, or switch between them following a specific pattern, for instance doing 2 lows followed by a move that beats crouch blocking. Please don't use this example as a recipe though. It's always going to be a gamble, unless you're fighting someone who fits Vass's definition of insanity. But with patience and observations, your opponent will show their habits to you, and you'll increase your odds of guessing right dramatically. Alright, I realize after the edit that I might have made this sound easier than intended. In principle it really is that simple, but that can be difficult to put in practice when someone is literally trying to kick you in the shins. That's why the lab can help you get the answers quicker, and that's probably the origin of the misconception about labbing being a requirement to get good. But learning to do this on the fly will take you to the next level, and the lab can't help you with that. So get in the queue and get real-world experience.